The Billionaire's Christmas Secret. The Perfect Christmas Dinner. Snow quietly blanketed the streets of Manhattan as Christmas Eve arrived with its usual glittering charm. The city lights reflected off the falling snowflakes, making the night look like something out of a dream. High above the city, on the top floor of the Harrington Tower, a luxurious penthouse glowed warmly. Inside, a grand Christmas dinner was about to begin. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above a massive dining table set with golden plates, silver cutlery, and red velvet napkins folded like roses. A 20-foot Christmas tree stood near the marble staircase, decorated with glass ornaments and thousands of tiny lights. Soft Christmas music played from a live pianist in the corner. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked like the life of Adrian Harrington, one of the youngest billionaires in New York. But perfection can hide terrible secrets. The wife. At the top of the grand staircase stood Lillian Harrington. She gently placed one hand on her belly. She was 7 months pregnant. Her long emerald dress flowed softly around her figure, and her dark hair rested over her shoulders like silk. From the outside, she looked like the perfect billionaire's wife. But inside, she felt something else. Fear. Her eyes scanned the room below where guests laughed and drank champagne. Business partners, politicians, socialites. People who admired Adrian Harrington. But none of them knew what she knew. None of them knew what kind of man he truly was. Footsteps echoed behind her. A familiar voice followed. "Lillian, everyone is waiting for you." She turned slowly. Adrian Harrington stood there, tall and elegant in a black tuxedo. His smile was charming, but his eyes were cold, very cold. "You should be downstairs greeting our guests," he said smoothly. Lillian forced a polite smile. "I was just coming." Adrian walked closer, adjusting his cufflinks. For a moment, he glanced at her belly. His expression hardened slightly. "Remember," he said quietly, "tonight is important." "I know. Investors are here. People who are about to trust me with billions of dollars." Lillian nodded. "And they expect to see a happy family." His hand gently touched her back, but the pressure of his fingers felt more like a warning. "Don't embarrass me tonight." The guests. When Lillian finally descended the staircase, the room grew brighter. People noticed her immediately. "Oh my goodness, Lillian looks radiant. She's glowing. The Harrington baby will be the most spoiled child in Manhattan." Lillian smiled politely as people congratulated her. Inside, however, her heart was racing, because earlier that afternoon she had found something terrible, something that explained Adrian's sudden anger over the past few weeks. Inside his office desk, she had discovered documents, DNA documents, and one name highlighted in bold letters: Michael Cross. A man she had not seen in 3 years. The man Adrian hated more than anyone else. The man Adrian believed had disappeared forever. But the documents said something shocking. Adrian believed the baby was not his. Lillian had tried to confront him earlier, but before she could speak, he simply smiled and said, "We'll talk after the party." And that smile had terrified her. The dinner begins. Guests gathered around the enormous dining table. Crystal glasses were filled. Champagne flowed like water. Adrian stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. "My friends," he began, Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate Christmas and the future of the Harrington family." Applause filled the room. Lillian sat beside him, quietly. Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder. To everyone else, the gesture looked loving, but she felt his fingers tighten, painfully. He leaned close to her ear and whispered something only she could hear. "You should have destroyed those papers." Her blood ran cold. He knew. He knew she had seen them. Her hands trembled under the table. Adrian smiled and continued his speech. "Next year," he said proudly, "this family will grow." Guests cheered, but Lillian felt something terrible forming in the air, something dangerous, something final. The stairs. Dinner ended an hour later. Guests moved to the lounge area for dessert and drinks. Some admired the Christmas tree. Others gathered near the fireplace. Lillian quietly stood from her chair. "I'm going upstairs for a moment," she said softly. Adrian watched her carefully. "Of course," he replied. But he followed. As she climbed the grand marble staircase, her heart pounded. She reached the middle landing and suddenly heard Adrian's footsteps behind her, slow, heavy, dangerous. Lillian. She turned slowly. His expression had completely changed. No charm, no smile, only rage. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" he asked. Her voice trembled. "Adrian, please listen." "I did listen." He pulled the DNA report from his pocket and waved it in front of her face. "The baby isn't mine." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're misunderstanding." "Don't lie to me." His voice echoed through the staircase. Guests below stopped talking. Lillian placed a hand on the railing. "Please, we can talk privately." Adrian stepped closer. His eyes were burning with fury. "You humiliated me." "No." "You betrayed me." She shook her head desperately. "I never meant." But Adrian suddenly grabbed her arm, hard. Pain shot through her body. "Adrian, you're hurting me." His grip tightened. And then he said the words that would change everything. "You and that baby ruined my life." Her breath stopped. "No." His eyes turned icy. "And tonight I fixed that mistake." Before she could react, he shoved her. The fall. Everything happened in seconds. Her foot slipped on the marble stair. Her body lost balance. Her hands reached for the railing, but Adrian's shove had been too strong. She fell backwards. 1 step, 2 steps. Then her body rolled violently down the grand staircase. Guests screamed. Glass shattered. Someone shouted, "Call 911!" Lillian's body hit the bottom of the stairs with a terrible sound. She lay motionless, blood slowly spreading across the white marble floor. Adrian ran down the stairs dramatically. "Oh my God!" He dropped to his knees beside her. "Lillian! Lillian!" Guests surrounded them in horror. Someone cried. Someone called an ambulance. Adrian looked around at everyone, then said the words calmly. "It was an accident." But as Lillian's eyes slowly opened, she looked directly at him and whispered something that froze his blood. "You pushed me." Then everything went dark. The hospital truth. The sound of sirens tore through the snowy Manhattan night as red and blue lights flashed against the glass towers as the ambulance raced through traffic towards St. Matthew Medical Center. Inside the ambulance, the air smelled of antiseptic and cold metal. Machines beeped urgently. Paramedics moved quickly around Lillian Harrington, whose body lay strapped to a stretcher. Her emerald dress had been cut open so doctors could reach the injuries beneath. Bruises were forming across her ribs. A thin line of blood ran down her temple. But the most important thing was the monitor beside her. A small, rhythmic sound echoed in the ambulance. Beep, beep, beep. One of the paramedics looked at the screen and nodded. Baby's heartbeat is still stable. The other paramedic leaned close to Lillian. Mrs. Harrington, can you hear me? For a moment, there was no response. Then her eyelids twitched. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. The bright lights above her blurred into white streaks. Lillian, the paramedic said softly, you're safe. You're in the ambulance. We're taking you to the hospital. Her breathing trembled. The memory returned suddenly. The staircase, Adrian's face, his words, you ruined my life. Her chest tightened. He pushed me, she whispered weakly. The paramedic leaned close. The billionaire returns. The hospital room had never felt so tense. For several seconds, no one spoke. The police officers looked from Lillian to Michael Cross, trying to understand the situation that had suddenly become far more complicated than a simple accident. A pregnant billionaire's wife had fallen down the stairs. She had accused her husband of pushing her, and now a mysterious man had appeared claiming the baby she carried was his. One of the officers finally broke the silence. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully, "are you aware of the seriousness of the claim you just made?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Because if what you're saying is true," the officer continued, "this situation may involve motive for attempted murder." Michael nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I'm here." The officer closed his notebook. "Then maybe you should start explaining." Adrian's fear. Across the city, in the cold lobby of St. Matthew's Medical Center, Adrian Harrington stepped out of his black limousine. Snow continued to fall lightly across the empty street. His driver opened an umbrella above him, but Adrian hardly noticed. His mind was racing. The police had informed him that Lillian was alive. Alive meant danger. Alive meant questions. Alive meant she might tell the truth. And Adrian had worked far too hard building his empire to let everything collapse because of one mistake. He walked quickly through the hospital doors. Inside the lobby, reporters were already gathering. Flashes from cameras lit up the room. "Mr. Harrington, is it true your wife fell during your Christmas party? Was it an accident?" Adrian stopped briefly and forced a tired smile. "My wife had a fall," he said calmly, "but the doctors are taking excellent care of her." "Did anyone push her?" a reporter asked suddenly. Adrian's expression hardened for just a moment. Then he shook his head. Of course not. But as he turned toward the elevators, something inside him felt wrong. A strange feeling, like someone had just stepped back into his life. Someone dangerous. Someone he had hoped never to see again. The past. Back in Lillian's hospital room, the officers had begun recording the conversation. "Start from the beginning," one officer said. Michael nodded, then looked at Lillian. 3 years ago," he began quietly, "Lillian and I were engaged." The officers looked surprised. "She never told us that," one of them said. "That's because Adrian made sure no one ever heard that story," Michael replied. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. The memories hurt, but they were true. Michael continued. "I met when I was building my first technology company. She was working in finance for her father's firm." The officer wrote notes quickly. "And what happened?" Michael's expression darkened. Adrian happened. The rivalry. 3 years earlier, Michael Cross had been one of the fastest rising tech entrepreneurs in the world. His company had been valued at nearly $5 billion. Investors loved him. The media called him the next Silicon Valley genius. But Adrian Harrington hated him because Adrian had tried to buy Michael's company, and Michael had refused. That refusal started a war. Adrian used every connection he had in banking and politics to destroy Michael's business. Loans were suddenly canceled, investors culled out, legal investigations appeared overnight. Within 6 months, Michael's empire collapsed. To the public, it looked like a financial disaster, but Michael knew the truth. Adrian Harrington had orchestrated everything, and while Michael was fighting to save his company, Adrian approached Lillian, offering comfort, protection, and eventually, marriage. The secret. The officer looked up from his notes. So you're saying Mr. Harrington deliberately destroyed your company? Michael shrugged slightly. I can't prove it legally, he was careful. But that still doesn't explain the baby, the officer said. Michael looked at Lillian again. We saw each other one last time, before everything ended. Lillian's voice trembled. It was the night before he disappeared. The officer's pen paused. And you became pregnant? Lillian nodded slowly. Yes. The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what that meant. Adrian Harrington had married a woman already carrying another man's child, and he had just discovered the truth. Adrian arrives. At that exact moment, the hospital room door opened. Adrian Harrington stepped inside. He froze immediately when he saw who was standing beside Lillian's bed, Michael Cross. For the first time in years, the two men faced each other again. The air between them felt like electricity. Adrian's jaw tightened. You. Michael didn't smile. Hello, Adrian. The police officers looked between them carefully. Adrian walked slowly toward the bed. His eyes flickered briefly to Lillian's stomach, then back to Michael. I thought you disappeared. Michael shrugged. I took some time off. Adrian laughed quietly. From bankruptcy? Michael's eyes remained calm. You really should keep up with financial news. Adrian frowned. What does that mean? Michael reached into his coat pocket and placed a small folded newspaper on the table. The headline was from that morning. Adrian read it, and his face suddenly lost color. Tech genius Michael Cross returns. New company valued at $12 billion. Adrian looked back at him slowly. You rebuilt everything? Michael nodded. Bigger than before. The officers watched the exchange with growing interest. But Michael wasn't finished. He leaned slightly closer to Adrian. And now, he said quietly, I'm here to protect my child. The words echoed through the hospital room like a thunderclap. Adrian's eyes burned with rage. That child is my heir. Michael shook his head calmly. No. Lillian whispered weakly from the bed. Stop! But Adrian ignored her. His voice dropped dangerously low. You have no proof. Michael turned toward the officers. I'd like to request a paternity test. Adrian laughed coldly. You think that will save you? Michael met his gaze. No. He leaned even closer. This will destroy you. The hidden evidence. One of the officers suddenly received a message on his radio. He listened for a moment. Then his eyes widened. What is it? The other officer asked. The officer looked directly at Adrian. We just received security footage from the Harrington penthouse. Adrian's body went completely still. The officer continued. The staircase camera. Lillian's breathing quickened. Michael crossed his arms quietly. And? He asked. The officer swallowed. It clearly shows Mr. Harrington pushing his wife. The room exploded with tension. Lillian began crying softly. Adrian stared at the officer in disbelief. That's impossible. Michael's voice was calm. Looks like your perfect crime wasn't perfect after all. The officer stepped forward. Mr. Harrington, we need you to come with us. Adrian looked around the room. His empire, his reputation, his life. Everything was collapsing in front of him, and for the first time, he realized he might actually lose. The fall of an empire. The hospital room had turned completely silent. Snow continued falling outside the large glass windows, but inside the room, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating. Two police officers stood beside Adrian Harrington, and for the first time in many years, the powerful billionaire looked uncertain. Mr. Harrington, one officer said firmly, we need you to come with us. Adrian turned his head slowly. You're arresting me based on a camera angle? The officer replied calmly. It's not just an angle. He pulled out his tablet and opened the video. Everyone in the room watched. The footage from the Harrington penthouse staircase camera began playing. The video. The recording showed the grand Christmas party. Guests laughing, waiters moving through the room, music playing softly. Then the camera focused on the staircase. Lillian appeared first, walking slowly up the stairs. Moments later, Adrian followed. At first, everything looked normal. They spoke briefly, but then the video clearly showed Adrian grabbing her arm. The argument grew intense, and then Adrian shoved her hard. Her body fell backward. She tumbled down the marble staircase. Gasps filled the hospital room. Even the nurses watching from the doorway were shocked. The video ended with guests rushing toward her unconscious body. The officer looked up slowly. "Would you like to explain that?" Adrian's face had gone pale. For years, he had controlled every situation, every deal, every rival. But this time, the evidence was undeniable. Lillian speaks. From the hospital bed, she was shaking. Her voice was weak but determined. "He said the baby ruined his life," she whispered. Michael stood beside her quietly. Adrian stared at her with cold fury. "You're making a mistake," he said. But Lillian shook her head. "No, the mistake was marrying you." The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, you are under arrest for attempted murder." He placed handcuffs around Adrian's wrists. The metallic click echoed through the room. A billionaire, handcuffed. The moment felt unreal, but Adrian didn't panic. Instead, he slowly turned toward Michael and smiled. Adrian's warning. "You think you've won," Adrian said quietly. Michael didn't react. Adrian leaned closer. "You really should have stayed." The shadow in the garage. The underground parking garage was silent. Only the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed across the concrete walls. Michael Cross stood beside his car, the photograph still in his hand. The image showed Lillian asleep in her hospital bed. It had clearly been taken only minutes ago. Someone had been inside her room. Someone who wanted Michael to know they were watching. Michael's instincts sharpened immediately. He slowly turned and scanned the garage. Rows of parked cars, empty spaces, cold air drifting through the open entrance, but no people, no movement. Still, the feeling remained. Someone had been there, and they had left the message on purpose. Back in the hospital, Michael returned to the hospital floor quickly. His mind raced as the elevator climbed. When the doors opened, he walked directly to Lillian's room. 2 nurses were standing outside, talking quietly. "Was anyone inside the room a few minutes ago?" Michael asked. The nurses looked confused. "Just the doctor earlier," one replied. Michael frowned. "Anyone else?" "No." Michael pushed the door open immediately. Inside, Lillian was awake, sitting slightly upright in the hospital bed. She looked relieved when she saw him. "Michael, you scared me. Where did you go?" Michael closed the door behind him. "We have a problem." Her eyes widened. "What kind of problem?" He placed the photograph on the bedside table. Lillian looked down at it, and her face instantly went pale. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my car," Michael said quietly. "Someone left it in the parking garage." Lillian's hands trembled. "But I've been here the whole time." Michael nodded. "Exactly." A heavy silence filled the room, because both of them understood what it meant. Someone had entered the hospital room without being noticed. Someone had stood close enough to take a picture of her, and that person was still somewhere nearby. The camera footage. Within 30 minutes, hospital security was reviewing camera footage. Michael and one of the police detectives stood in the security office. "Let's rewind the hallway cameras," the detective said. The security guard nodded and played the recording. The video showed the quiet hospital corridor outside Lillian's room. Nurses walking past, doctors entering and leaving rooms. Everything looked normal. Then something strange happened. A man wearing a hospital janitor uniform walked toward Lillian's door. The detective leaned forward. Pause. The video froze. The man's face was partially hidden by a cap, but something about him looked familiar. The guard zoomed in. Michael stared carefully. Then, suddenly, his eyes widened. "That's not a janitor." The detective looked at him. "You recognize him?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes." "Who is he?" Michael's voice became cold. "That's Victor Kane." The detective frowned. "Who's Victor Kane?" Michael exhaled slowly. "Adrian Harrington's personal security chief. The man who never failed." Victor Kane had once been a military intelligence officer. After leaving the army, he had built a reputation as one of the most ruthless private security specialists in the country. For 10 years, he had worked exclusively for Adrian Harrington. His job was simple: solve problems, quietly and permanently. Michael pointed to the screen. "He's the man Adrian uses when things need to disappear." The detective crossed his arms. "And you think he came here to threaten you?" Michael shook his head no. His voice turned darker. "I think he came here to finish what Adrian started." The jail visit. At that same moment, across the city, Adrian Harrington sat calmly inside a private interview room at the Manhattan Detention Center. Even in prison clothes, he looked confident. A guard opened the door. "Your visitor is here." Adrian smiled slightly. "Send him in." Moments later, the door opened again, and Victor Kane walked inside. The two men looked at each other for a moment. Then Adrian leaned back in his chair. "You took your time." Victor sat down across from him. "The hospital has increased security." Adrian nodded. "Did you deliver the message?" "Yes." Adrian's smile widened slightly. "Good." Victor studied him carefully. "You're enjoying this." Adrian shrugged. "Michael Cross thinks he won." Victor leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Adrian's voice dropped to a whisper. "The same plan we always use." Victor waited. Adrian looked directly into his eyes. "Remove the problem." Victor nodded once. "And the woman?" Adrian's expression hardened. "She knows too much." Victor stood up slowly. "Understood." But before leaving, he asked one final question. "And the baby?" Adrian's eyes turned cold. That child should never be born. Michael's realization. Back at the hospital, Michael stood near the window of Lillian's room. Outside, snow continued falling over the city. The detective had already sent officers to search for Victor Kane, but Michael knew something the police didn't. Victor Kane never failed. If he had come to the hospital, he wasn't finished yet. Michael turned toward Lillian. "You're not safe here anymore." Her voice trembled. "What do we do?" Michael took out his phone. "I'm calling someone." "Who?" Michael smiled slightly. "The only people Adrian Harrington can't control." The call connected. "Send the car, now." Lillian looked confused. "Where are we going?" Michael's voice was calm but firm. "Somewhere Adrian will never find you." But deep down, Michael knew the truth. Adrian Harrington was not the type of man who gave up, and the real battle was only beginning. The safe house. Snow covered the city like a quiet white blanket as midnight approached. Most of Manhattan had fallen silent after the chaos of the previous days. News channels were still discussing the arrest of billionaire Adrian Harrington, but the city itself seemed to be trying to breathe again. Inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, though, the tension had not disappeared. Michael Cross stood beside Lillian's hospital bed, watching the hallway through the small glass window in the door. Police officers had increased security on the floor, but Michael still didn't trust it, not when Victor Kane was involved. Victor was the kind of man who could walk through 10 guards and never be noticed. Lillian noticed the worry in Michael's face. "Michael, you look like you're preparing for war." Michael gave a small, serious smile. "In a way, I am." Her hand rested on her stomach.
What if we're overreacting? Adrian is already in jail. Michael shook his head immediately. Adrian Harrington doesn't lose control easily. He stepped closer to the bed, and he never works alone. The quiet escape. 30 minutes later, the hospital corridor lights dimmed for the night shift. A quiet nurse entered Lillian's room, but this nurse was not part of the hospital staff. She was part of Michael's private security team. "We're ready," she said quietly. Michael nodded. Within minutes, Lillian was carefully placed into a wheelchair. The nurse wrapped a thick winter coat around her coming to hide the hospital gown. Michael pushed the wheelchair into the hallway. 2 large men in black jackets walked ahead of them. Security. Not hospital security. Michael's security. The group moved quickly toward the private elevator at the hall. The doors opened, and within seconds, they were descending toward the underground garage. Lillian whispered nervously, "Where are we going?" Michael answered calmly, "A safe house." The ride through the snow. A black SUV waited in the far corner of the garage. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Within moments, they were driving through the quiet, snow-covered streets. The city lights blurred across the windows as the car moved toward the outskirts of Manhattan. For several minutes, no one spoke. Finally, Lillian broke the silence. "Michael, I need to ask you something." He turned toward her. "What is it?" "Why are you helping me like this?" Michael looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Because I never stopped loving you." Her eyes filled with emotion. "But after everything? After Adrian?" Michael shook his head gently. "That never changed how I felt." Lillian looked down at her stomach. "And the baby?" Michael smiled softly. "The baby deserves a safe life." The safe house. An hour later, the SUV turned onto a quiet road surrounded by tall pine trees. At the end of the road stood a modern glass house hidden deep in the woods. Soft lights glowed from inside. The driver parked near the entrance. "This is it," Michael said. The house belonged to one of his private companies. It didn't exist on public records. Very few people even knew it was there. Inside, the house was warm and peaceful. A fireplace burned softly in the living room. Michael helped Lillian sit on a comfortable sofa. "You'll be safe here. No reporters, no strangers, no Adrian." For the first time in days, Lillian seemed to be able to breathe. She closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you." But just as the calm settled over the room, Michael's phone vibrated.
The forest around the safe house was completely silent. Snow continued falling slowly through the tall pine trees, covering the ground in a soft white layer. From the outside, the modern glass house looked peaceful, almost invisible among the trees. But peace was an illusion, because Victor Kane was already there. He moved silently through the snow, his dark coat blending with the shadows between the trees. Every step he took was careful and controlled. Victor had spent years in military intelligence. Stealth was second nature to him, and tonight he had one simple mission: finish the job. Inside the safe house. Inside the warm living room, Michael Cross stood near the large window, staring into the darkness outside. His instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He had already placed 2 of his security guards outside the house, but Victor Kane wasn't the kind of man ordinary security could stop. Lillian sat on the couch, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "Michael," she whispered nervously, "why is it so quiet?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pistol. Lillian's eyes widened. "You think he's already here?" Michael's voice was calm but serious. "I don't think." He looked toward the forest. "I know." The first shot. Outside, Victor reached the edge of the property. He could see the lights glowing inside the house. Through the glass walls, he saw movement. Michael and Lillian. Victor slowly raised a small device in his hand, a suppressed pistol. Before approaching the house, he calmly scanned the area. Then he spotted one of Michael's guards walking along the side of the building. Victor fired once. Thup. The silenced shot barely made a sound. The guard collapsed instantly into the snow. Victor moved forward. Inside the house, Michael suddenly froze. "What?" Lillian asked. He raised a finger. "Did you hear that?" Lillian listened carefully. At first, nothing. Then Michael's phone buzzed. A message from his security system. Outdoor camera offline. Michael's heart dropped. "Victor is here," he said quietly. Lillian's breathing became fast. "What do we do?" Michael quickly moved toward the back hallway. "There's a panic room downstairs." He helped her stand carefully. "Stay inside until I come back." "No," she said immediately. "I'm not leaving you." Michael looked at her seriously. "If Victor gets inside this house, he won't hesitate." Lillian's voice trembled. "Neither will you." Michael didn't answer, but the silence between them said everything. The broken window. Outside, Victor reached the glass wall of the living room. He looked inside carefully. Empty. He smiled slightly. They knew he was coming. Good. Victor smashed a small corner of the glass with a tool and quietly unlocked the door from the inside. The door slowly opened. Cold air rushed into the warm living room. Victor stepped inside. The hunt had begun. The dark hallway. Michael heard the door open. He quickly moved Lillian toward the hidden staircase leading to the panic room. "Go," he whispered. "But go!" She slowly began descending the stairs. Michael turned off the main lights. The house fell into darkness. Only the faint glow from the fireplace remained. Footsteps echoed from the living room. Victor's voice finally broke the silence. Michael Cross. Calm. Cold. Almost amused. "I know you're here." Michael stepped into the hallway shadows. "You always did enjoy dramatic entrances, Victor." Victor appeared at the end of the hallway. The two men stared at each other. Old enemies. Both dangerous. Both ready for violence. Victor tilted his head slightly. "You should have stayed out of this." Michael tightened his grip on the pistol. "You should have chosen a different employer." Victor chuckled quietly. "Adrian pays well." Michael's eyes darkened. "He's going to prison." Victor shrugged. "That doesn't change my contract." Then Victor slowly raised his gun. The fight. The gunshot exploded through the house. Michael dove behind the wall as the bullet shattered a mirror. He fired back instantly. Victor moved like a shadow, disappearing behind the kitchen counter. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. The quiet safe house turned into chaos. Michael moved carefully down the hallway. Victor's voice echoed again. "You know Adrian wasn't lying." Michael froze. "What?" Victor fired another shot. "About the baby." Michael ducked again. "What are you talking about?" Victor stepped into the hallway again. "There's another father." Michael's mind raced. "That's impossible." Victor smirked slightly. "Adrian tested the DNA twice." Michael's heart pounded. "Who?" Victor shrugged. "You should ask Lillian." The truth begins. Downstairs in the panic room, Lillian sat in the darkness, trembling. She could hear the gunshots above. Her hands shook. Tears ran down her face, because Victor was right about one thing. There was something she had never told Michael, something she had been too afraid to admit, something that could destroy everything. The final shot. Upstairs, Michael stepped into the hallway again. Victor aimed his weapon. Both men fired at the same time. 2 gunshots echoed through the house. And then, silence. The truth that changed everything. The gunshots echoed through the silent forest. For a moment, the entire house fell completely quiet. Snow continued drifting softly outside, covering the ground, while inside the safe house, everything had stopped. Then a body hit the floor. Hard. Who was shot? Down in the panic room, Lillian held her breath. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "Michael," she whispered to herself. Tears ran down her cheeks as she slowly stood. The gunfire had stopped,
but the silence was even more terrifying. After a few seconds, she carefully opens the panic room door and walked up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her hands trembled as she reached the hallway. Then she saw them. 2 bodies on the floor, one near the wall, one closer to the kitchen. For a moment, her vision blurred with fear, but then she saw movement. Michael. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, holding his shoulder. Blood stained his shirt, but he was alive. Lillian ran toward him. "Michael!" He looked up and gave a weak smile. "I'm okay." She helped him sit against the wall. "Where's Victor?" Michael nodded toward the other body lying motionless on the floor. Victor Kane, the man who never failed. Now he lay still, his weapon beside him. Michael had fired the final shot, and this time, Victor Kane had lost. The end of Adrian's power. Within 20 minutes, police sirens filled the forest road. Officers surrounded the house. Paramedics rushed inside to treat Michael's wound. Victor Kane was taken away in handcuffs. He had survived the gunshot, but barely, and this time there would be no escaping the law. Because Victor wasn't the only one who was finished. Across the city, Adrian Harrington watched the news from his jail cell. The headline on the television read, "Harrington security chief arrested after attack on safe house." Adrian slowly leaned back in his chair. Everything he had built, his company, his reputation, his empire, it was all collapsing. Investigators had already begun uncovering his illegal accounts and business fraud. Michael's evidence had destroyed him completely. Within days, Adrian Harrington would be formally charged with attempted murder, financial fraud, and conspiracy. The billionaire who once controlled everything now faced life in prison. The final secret. A week later, Michael and Lillian sat together in a quiet hospital room. Michael's shoulder was healing well. Outside the window, the snow had finally stopped. For the first time in many days, things felt calm. But Michael knew something still remained unresolved. He looked at Lillian gently. "You never answered Victor's question." She looked down at her hands. "The baby?" Michael nodded. "He said Adrian tested the DNA twice." Her eyes filled with emotion. "I didn't tell you because I was scared." Michael stayed silent. 3 years ago, when everything between us was falling apart, we were separated for a few weeks." Michael remembered. It had been the most painful time in their relationship. "You told me you needed space," he said quietly. Lillian nodded slowly. "And during that time, Adrian comforted me." Michael's chest tightened. "But nothing happened," she quickly said. "At least, I thought nothing happened." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" She swallowed. "The night Adrian told me about the DNA test, he said something else." "What?" Her voice shook. "He said the baby could belong to either of you." The room fell silent. Michael stared at her. "You're saying, I don't know who the father is." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm sorry." Michael looked at her for a long moment. The truth had finally come out. The child she carried might be his, or it might be Adrian Harrington's. Either possibility could change everything, but Michael slowly reached for her hand and held it gently. "Listen to me."